Okay.
Hey everyone, how's it going? Alrighty.
It's going very well.
Glad to hear that. Thanks for sharing. It's good to hear from y'all because I know that sometimes it's hard in a class this big and when we're kind of distant from everybody on our computer screens. So great to hear that. So today we're going to start talking about biopsych, and so you have your next Explain It to the Media quiz. So those of you who are here can go ahead and get started. So you're going to go to Blackboard, you're going to go to exams and quizzes, and it should be the only thing available. You're going to go to Explain It, the Media quiz 3. I'll give you all about 15-20 minutes to do that. I'm going to mute myself so you don't get any background noise from me, but if you have any questions, please either type them in the chat. Actually, do type them in the chat so we don't break people's concentration. So if you have any questions, just stick them in the chat and I'll be paying attention so that I can answer for you. So folks who have just joined us, we're doing Explain It to the Media quiz 3. I'll recopy how you get there. Go to Blackboard, exams, quizzes, and then Explain It to the Media quiz 3. And then I'm asking anyone who has a question, just put it in the chat so that we don't disrupt people's concentration. Alrighty, so If you're still finishing the last question or so, go ahead and keep doing that while I start talking. But from Blackboard, it looks like there's only a couple people finishing up. So we should be good to go here. So today we're going to start talking about biopsychology. So this really is the intersection of biology and psychology, maybe not surprisingly. But this is where we start talking about the brain and other aspects of the body that really do influence psychology and how they work and how we explain them. So this is the part that sometimes surprises students who aren't as familiar with psychology, because if you just sort of think of psychology as, talking to people or thinking about social constructs, this might not be as familiar to you. But in fact, this is a big part of psychology in general now. Most subfields are looking at biological factors. And also there are huge subfields within psychology that look at this. So biopsychologists study these things, either in human or in animals, as we spoke about the other day. Neuropsychologists, particularly clinical neuropsychologists, look at these in applied ways. So there's a whole host of ways that you can look at these things through research, through clinical work. We're doing research where we put people in, brain scans and have them do tests and see what happens. So there's a lot of really cool stuff going on with this in this day and age. So I'm going to go ahead and get my mini podium here. And then I will share my screen and we can start talking about biopsych. And again, just a reminder, all these PowerPoints are posted on Blackboard. Okay. I'm gonna pull out the chat in case anybody has any questions. So we're really talking about the biological bases of behavior when we talk about biopsychology. So we're talking about the brain and neurons. Obviously, this is pretty technical. A lot of it is neurobiology or neuroanatomy. I'm going to try to explain things as clearly as I can. Please feel free to stick questions in the chat or unmute yourself and ask questions as we go. So as humans, we have a tendency to take for granted the integrity and normal functioning of the nervous system. Only when there's damage through stroke, disease, or brain trauma do we often realize its importance. For example, we think of something like Parkinson's disease, which actor Michael J. Fox has, for example. So we'll talk about the neuron. So go ahead and type answers in the chat here. What are you doing right now? And you can be honest. Are you thinking, daydreaming, writing notes? What are you doing right now? Eating, yes. Highly approved. This is a great time to eat. And a neuron, yes. Love the honesty. Someone has their puppy. I'm jealous. Got your notebook. Some people are chewing gum, taking notes. Yeah. All of those things that you're typing are things that our neurons allow us to do. Reading while listening to this, yeah, that's really great too. Seeing if you can multitask. So the neuron is an individual cell in the nervous system. So an individual cell in the nervous system that receives, integrates, and transmits information. So receives, integrates, and transmits information. Yeah, Davion, I don't know why you can't hear me. Try different sound settings on your device, and if that doesn't work, what you can do is just watch the video later. If it gets frustrating, feel free to sign off now, because I know that that could feel frustrating. Because it sounds like everybody else can hear me, so I apologize. I don't know what's going on your end there. Alrighty. So neurons come in many shapes and sizes. So this is a typical neuron. This is the diagram you'll most typically say. Oh, what did I say after receives? Thank you for clarifying. Receive, integrate, and transmit. So receive, integrate, and transmit information. So it gets it, it combines it, and it passes it on. And sometimes it's passing it on to another neuron, and sometimes it's passing it on to maybe a muscle or an organ in your body. So this is, again, a diagram of a typical neuron, and you'll often hear the term nerve used or nerve cell, but what actually a nerve is a bundle of neurons. So a nerve is just a bundle of neurons. The basic components of the nerving system are the neurons, but there's also cells called glial cells that we'll talk about in a little bit. And glia are cells that provide structure and insulation. They're kind of like the glue. And I'm gonna lean forward real quick and apologize. We use a cleaning service, and right now they're vacuuming, so you'll hear that in the background. So just heads up there. I'll try to get closer and speak loud for y'all. So neurons allow us to communicate within our bodies. The nervous system is the body's communication network. It handles information just as the circulatory system handles blood. So just like your heart and your veins and your arteries pass blood around your body, your neurons pass information around your body. So the soma, and I'm gonna try and show you with my mouse, hopefully this will show up. The soma is the cell body. It's this part here that kind of looks, I don't know, like hexagonal or like an octagon on your diagram. And this contains the nucleus, which is right here. So if you think back to like when you first learned the parts of the cell, maybe high school bio or middle school bio, that's the nucleus, okay? And the nucleus contains the genetic material of the cell. So soma is the cell body. The nucleus is the red part in the middle of this particular diagram. And I'm not sure why my mouse is like drawing on the screen. Give me a second here. I'm gonna try a new share where that won't happen. So you don't end up with weird things on there. Alrighty, so share screen. And try doing this again.
Is someone vacuuming there here? Yeah, I don't know.
So yeah, sorry, I leaned forward and said that. Yeah, we use a cleaning service. Oh yay, Davion, you can hear me. Hooray! So we use a cleaning service, and you might hear them in the background. So I'll try to be as clear as I can in the meantime. So, all right. I'm going to try resharing, and hopefully it won't draw weird lines on the screen anymore. I don't know what that was about. And hopefully you'll be able to hear me better now as well. All right, so the soma is the part of the cell that looks sort of like a stop sign there, and the nucleus is the red part in the middle. The soma is the cell body, and the nucleus is the organelle of the cell that contains the genetic material. So here's where your DNA resides, just like in any one of your cells. The dendrites are these things that kind of look like branches that branch off from the soma, from the cell body. They're branching structures, and they receive messages from other neurons. So the dendrites receive the messages from the other neurons. The axon is this long thing that kind of looks like a trunk. And this is a long extension of the neuron that carries nerve impulses away from the body of the cell. And then the axon terminals are the hair-like extensions down here on the right side of your diagram. And those carry nerve impulses away from the cell body and transmit them. And the axon terminals have hair-like extensions, and these buttons are what then communicates with the dendrites of the next cell. So essentially, let me walk you through it. You get a message down in the dendrites on your left-hand side, and then that goes down the axon and to the axon terminal button, and then that message is given to the next dendrites of the next neuron. So again, this is just a communication network, essentially. So then you have the myelin sheath. It's this sort of like purpley pink color on your diagram here. And this is the insulating material. So this speeds up transmission on the axon, because essentially rather than having to go down the whole axon, the messages can kind of hop in between the nodes on the myelin sheath. It's a fatty substance. It protects and surrounds the axon. And the nodes are called the nodes of Ranvier or Ranvier. I'm actually not, I'm pronouncing it the French way because I took French before, but I'm gonna type that in the chat for you so you have the spelling. Let me just move that out of the way. And grab the chat real quick here. There we go. That's the little parts in between each section of myelin sheath. Those are called the nodes of Ranvier. Oh, and I think I might have sent that privately for some reason. Let me resend it to everybody. Isn't technology fun, y'all? There we go. There we go. Okay. So these are the gaps in the myelin sheath. This is where the action potential occurs during conduction along the axon. Then the terminal button doesn't actually touch the next dendrite. Essentially, what happens inside the neuron is electrical activity, and you wouldn't just want essentially little lightning jumping from neuron to neuron, right? That would probably be problematic in your brain. So instead, what happens is when it gets to the terminal button, the message is converted to a chemical message using something called neurotransmitters. So we'll talk about that on coming slides. But these are chemical messages that go between the axon terminal button of one neuron to the dendrite of the next neuron. So electrical impulse down the neuron, and then there's a chemical message that goes between neurons. Alrighty, so we're going to talk about how information is transmitted along the neuron next, covering the following topics: the resting potential, the action potential, the all or none principle, the synapse, synaptic transmission. So each of these are going to have their own slide. So if you didn't get all those down, you're good. Okay, so the neuron at rest. So back in the 50s, Alan Hodgkin and Andrew Huxley discovered the mechanics of neural transmission by studying giant squid. And so as I mentioned the other day, we use giant squid because their neurons are huge. So it's a lot easier to see than, say, a human neuron. They're about 100 times larger than human axons, actually. So again, much more clear to see than ours, which are microscopic. They found that fluids inside and outside of the neuron carry electrically charged particles, and these are called ions. So both inside the neuron and outside the neuron are these ions, these electrically charged particles. They also found that when the neuron's at rest, so when it's not actually in the process of actively transmitting a message, the inside has more negative ions, so a more negative charge compared to the outside of the neuron. So When a neuron is at rest, the inside has more negative ions than the outside. The stable negative charge of a neuron, when it is inactive, is called the resting potential. So you see that phrase here, resting potential. And the charge is negative 70 millivolts. So when a neuron's just sort of hanging out, waiting for another message, it's at this negative 70 millivolts, and that's called the resting potential. Okay, and this shows you how they measure this again. Obviously much easier to do with a giant squid neuron than a human neuron. So this gives you an idea about the resting potential, and then what we're going to talk about next, which is the action potential. So the electrical chemical properties of the neuron are what allow it to transmit signals. So the electrical charge of the neuron can be measured with these electrodes connected to an oscilloscope, which gives us the reading of these graphs on the right-hand side of your screen. And again, Hodgkin and Huxley were the first ones to do it, and they did it with the squid axon. Because of its exceptionally thick axons, the squid has frequently been used by scientists studying the neural impulse. In fact, I believe Freud actually did some work with squid neurons. Freud was actually trained as a neurologist initially and did some work on neurons and had a whole theory about how neurons work. That isn't accurate, but the idea that he was coming up with it in the late 1800s is really rather progressive. So at rest, as we just mentioned, the neuron's voltage hovers around negative 70 millivolts. So you see this on the top graph, that it's kind of just staying around negative 70, right? And when the axon is stimulated, there is a very brief jump in the neuron's voltage, resulting in a spike on the oscilloscope, as you see in the bottom graph here. And this records the neuron's change in electrical activity. This change in voltage is the action potential. Okay, so this little spike that we see on the bottom graph is what's called the action potential. And this travels along the axon almost like a spark traveling along a trail of gunpowder. Except remember, it has the sheath to help it, and so it actually hops between the nodes of Ranvier, making it much more efficient than if it had to go the whole length of the axon. Really interesting thing about action potentials is they're always the same size. So they're always going to spike this amount. Good question. So I think that the way they do it is they sort of like run an electrical charge through it, or maybe they did it on the live squid. I've never actually found this out, Lara. So if you want to look that up and let us know in the comments, that would be really awesome. Because I don't actually know if they did it while the squid was dead or alive. All right, so the action potential. This is that brief shift in electrical charge that travels down the axon, again, hopping between the nodes. And the stimulation that you get at the dendrites and then goes down the cell body into the axon causes channels in the cell membrane of the axon to open briefly. And this lets the ions flow in and out. And remember, at the resting potential, the inside of the axon is at negative 70, and then it's more positive outside. So when you open those up, then more positive ions can come in, more negative ions can go out. And this leads to the change in electrical charge that is the action potential, that little point on the graph. And again, very brief, very quick. This is how information is transmitted from one end of the axon all the way down to the other end, to those terminal buttons to pass it on, again, either to the next neuron or to, let's say, muscle or something along those lines. Now, action potential is governed by the all or none law. So So the best way to think about this is if you set up a whole bunch of dominoes, right? And you set them up all in a line and you go to tip one over. If you space them out evenly, right, they'll all fall. They'll go in a little chain reaction. If you didn't do it right, you'll tip over that first one and it'll just kind of go bloop and nothing will happen, right? So that's the all or none. Either it's lined up right and they all go, or it just sort of goes bloop and you don't have an action potential. Either an action potential occurs or it doesn't. Once an action potential is initiated, it goes full force. It goes all the way down the axon. It doesn't stop. And again, as we mentioned on our slide with the graphs, action potentials are always the same size, but the rate of firing can provide information about the strength of a stimulus. Okay, Laura, thanks for looking that up. So they used a voltage clamp to create electrical impulses. That makes sense. So the squid was deceased. And then they applied their own electrical impulses and then watched what happened through their measurement on the oscilloscope. That's really helpful. Thank you, Laura. I appreciate that. So again, and that, just like in a human, all or none. It's just going to go once it's stimulated, all the way down. So another way, and I usually do this in class, but we can't right now, to think about it is like the wave at a stadium, right? So that's how it travels down. And, you know, usually once the wave gets started, it at least does one circuit, right, of the whole stadium. I remember I was at a baseball game once and they just like kept doing it. And we were all like, why? Why are we still doing this? You know, it can get a little tiring. An important note here too is that right after people stand up in the wave, they sit down, right? They want to recover, they want to rest. And this is called a refractory period. And this is actually something that does occur with action potentials, that neurons need a little break in between action potentials. They can't just be constantly firing. So they're getting ready for the next go around, and that's where you end up with the resting potential. So again, this action potential is all or none. Let's make the example of you coming to class or not. So the excitatory postsynaptic potential, or EPSP, and again, I'll type that in the chat for you all. Move this right quick. So excitatory postsynaptic potential. This makes it more likely you'll go. So essentially it makes it more likely the neuron will fire, and it'd make it more likely that you'd come to class. So maybe your parents pressure you to attend your classes. They're like, you gotta go. You're at college for a reason, right? Or maybe you're thinking about our exam coming up in a couple weeks. You're like, oh, I wanna do well on that. I wanna make sure that I'm in class to get all that material. Or maybe you don't wanna waste your tuition money. I had a student before who figured out like how much money they wasted if they didn't come to class, and they came to class all the time unless they were really sick. So, you know, some of that can make a difference too, especially if you're the one paying your tuition, right? And maybe, hopefully, you also want to come. Maybe you find psychology interesting and you want to go and learn. But there's also the inhibitory synaptic potential. The IPSP. And these make it less likely you'll go to class. So in the case of the neuron, this would make it less likely that an action potential would happen. Maybe you had to pull an all-nighter, so you're tired, so you just don't feel like turning on your computer, or maybe you fall asleep and sleep through class. You know, that's happened to the best of it. That happened to me once in college. I slept through a quiz. I remember like tearing down the path to find my professor, and she was like, it's fine, you can just take it down. She was very understanding. She didn't have to be. Maybe your roommates want you to go for coffee with them. They're like, hey, let's go sit in the grill, socially distanced, and have some coffee. You know, that might be more appealing. This is one that doesn't apply right now, but could in other circumstances. You know, if you had to walk to class, maybe you don't want to leave your room because of the weather. And I always kind of tell this funny story that I had a student once told me when I was first teaching in the Midwest that he couldn't come to class if it were too rainy, or if it was snowing, or if it was too sunny or nice out. He wasn't going to bother. So basically, I guess only came to class if it was cloudy, right? So maybe there's certain types of weather that would keep you in your room. Again, not an issue right now, but were I teaching this in, you know, sort of a non-COVID semester, you would have to sort of truck over to the social science lab, for example, to do it. And depending on where you live, that might be more or less of a problem. If you're in Allen Village, hey, just throw on your slippers and walk over, right? If you're across campus in the Honors Village, it might be more daunting if it's, you know, pouring rain or there's hurricane force winds. Well, we'd probably be canceled then anyway. So in addition to all that, there are actually different types of neurons. So there are sensory neurons, and these carry messages from sense receptors throughout the body to the CNS. And the CNS is the central nervous system. Central nervous system. And the CNS consists of the brain and the spinal cord. So that's your CNS, central nervous system. And so sensory neurons take messages from things like our touch receptors. So they're the things that would tell us like, ooh, hey, you just like scraped your thumb. Or, hey, you know, the ground's uneven. We got to kind of check our balance here, right? They can also be things like, I'm smelling something, I'm tasting something, I'm hearing something, I'm seeing something. All of those come from sensory neurons, and when we talk about sensation and perception after the first exam, we'll talk about all that in a lot more detail. Then there are the motor neurons, and these carry messages from the central nervous system, so the brain and the spine, to your muscles and glands. So these are the ones that once the brain has some information about what's going on, they'll take this information and send messages to the muscles or the glands and say, hey, here's what you need to do. So, you know, oh, hey, the foot detected a pothole, let's step around it instead of, you know, falling into it. Or, oh, we scraped our thumb, maybe we should move it and like go get a Band-Aid on it if it's bleeding. Things along those lines. Or it could be even things like, ooh, delicious food entering our mouths, we should chew that and swallow it. So the motor neurons are what tells our body to do things. And the body does amazingly complex things, right? Without us having to actually think about it, because the nervous system just does it for us, right? We don't have to think, okay, while I'm talking, I want to gesture, so I better start telling my arm that it needs to move like this, right? Like, our brain just does it for us. So the brain really is remarkable, and this whole system of neurons is really remarkable as well. So sensory neurons carry messages to the CNS. Motor neurons carry messages away from the CNS. And then there's another type of neuron called the interneuron. And these carry messages between nerve cells, between other neurons. So these are in the central nervous system itself. These are the neurons in our spinal cords, in our brains, and they transmit messages within the central nervous system. So they get information from the sensory neurons, they send it throughout the brain, and then the brain sends messages to the motor neurons. So neurons come in many shapes and sizes, but they generally share common characteristics that we've discussed. So the next thing we're going to talk about is the reflex arc. And this even bypasses the thinking part of this. So the reflex arc is a nice example of how these neuron types work together. So again, neurons transfer information. So they take information from the stimulus, they take it to these interneurons, which on this slide are called association neurons. Okay, one of the annoying things about psychology is that different people come up with different names for the exact same thing. It's kind of frustrating sometimes, admittedly. But association neurons are the same things as interneurons. And then that presses it onto the motor neuron. And so let's say, in this case, the stimulus is you put your hand on something hot. Maybe you just pulled a pan out of the stove and you touch it. Okay, you don't want to have to wait, even as short as it is, for that message to go all the way up to the brain, get processed, and then come all the way back down, right? You want to react really quickly so you minimize the damage to your skin. So what happens then is that the stimulus hits the receptor, and that goes to the sensory neuron within the spinal cord. It just connects with this association or interneuron, and that immediately just pulls back your muscle, tells it like, hey, get it out of the way really quickly. And often what we find is that the stimulus and response neurons, so the sensory neurons and the motor neurons, are actually bundled together. So like the message kind of goes up and it comes back down the same bundle. So I do have a quick video to show y'all about this, and I'll see if my hyperlink still works. Nope. Okay, give me just a sec. All right, so I'm gonna do a new share and share this YouTube with you. Okay. Ah, what? Oh, it's gonna work. So this is Schoolhouse Rock. This used to be on TV, and they were little educational things. And it's going to use the analogy of a telegram, which is obviously, kind of an old thing. But this kind of shows you how the nervous system works in kind of a cutesy little way. And I just realized I need to actually share the sound with you all. That would be helpful. All right.
Telegram for you, ma'am, and the message is clear. It says there's something bugging you and buzzing in your ear. The results can be quite itchy, so what is your reply? Tell you're on the spot that fly. Hey, there's a telegraph line. You got yours and I got mine. It's called the nervous system, and everybody understands those telegram commands, and you know that everybody better listen. The central nervous system is the brain and the spine. The brain controls the system and the spine is the line. Telegrams come in to tell what's happening to you. Then telegrams go out to tell your body what to do. There's a telegram for you, sir. Better read it on the spot. It says your hand is near a stove that's very, very hot. The results can be quite painful, and there's no time to think. Quick, pull that hand away and get it to the sink. There's a telegram line. You got yours and I got mine. It's called the nervous system, and everybody understands those telegram commands, and you know that everybody better listen. Your peripheral nerves, they go all out, delivering those messages your senses send out. From your hearing and touch to your sight and taste and smell, they let your brain react to all the messages they tell. There's a telegram for you, kid, and it's at an awkward time. It says you've gotta go on stage and you forgot your lines. You're gonna be embarrassed cause this telegram's a rush. Your heart starts beating faster and you blush. Hey, there's a telegram line. You got yours and I got mine. It's called the nervous system, and everybody understands those telegram commands, and you know that everybody better listen. The autonomic system has a hold of you, controlling automatically some things that you do. Your breathing and your heartbeat just go on naturally. And when you're scared, your nerves rev up the speed. Hey, there's
someone said they remembered those from middle school. Awesome. I'm glad that they still exist out there in the universe. Yeah, this is like, that was the same program that did like conjunction, junction, what's your function? So if you remember any of that stuff, oh shoot, I exited the wrong thing. I'll just reopen my PowerPoint real quick here. That's what I get for singing while clicking. Into our slide here. And so as I'm clicking, I can clarify here a couple things. So one is that they talked about the peripheral nervous system, and that is the, get back into Zoom here. That is the both the sensory and the motor neurons are in the nervous system, the peripheral nervous system. And then the central nervous system is just the inner neurons. So it's the spine and the brain. And I'm having all kinds of problems here. So give me just a sec. I don't know what is happening. There we go. So it should show up. Try this one more time. You know, it wouldn't be a normal day if we didn't have tech issues. Hey, finally came up as something I could share. There we go. Yeah. So both the sensory and the motor neurons are part of the peripheral nervous system. And then over here with the association neurons, those are part of the central nervous system. So, and then there's lots of other ways you can break down the nervous system. And so we'll kind of talk about those throughout this lecture. And this is a lecture that I cover over 3 days because there's a lot of information. So the next thing that we'll start talking about here is what happens once you get to the end of that terminal button, that axon button. Because as I mentioned before, you can't send an electrical impulse across to the next neuron. It'd be really problematic, probably dangerous for our brains. We wouldn't really function well if we essentially always had like a lightning storm in our brain. So neurons don't actually touch at a synapse where they connect. They're separated by this microscopic gap, there we go, between the terminal button of one neuron, so what you see on top here, and then the dendrite of the next neuron. And this space is called the synaptic cleft. So it's like a little channel that runs between the axon terminal button and the dendrite of the next neuron. So again, electrical signals can't jump this gap. Instead, the neuron that's sending the message across the gap, and this is called the presynaptic neuron because it's before the synapse, okay, releases what are called neurotransmitters into the synaptic cleft. This occurs when the action potential gets to the terminal button, and it tells the synaptic vesicles, which are these things that kind of look like bubbles on your neuron diagram there, that they should fuse with the membrane at the end of the axon and let go of their neurotransmitter. So during the resting potential, the vesicles are just sort of storage containers for the neurotransmitters. So it's like, I don't know, a Rubbermaid container isn't a good analogy since they're porous, but you know, it's maybe like you have a Ziploc bag, right? And then you can open it once it fuses with the end of that presynaptic membrane to let the neurotransmitters out across the synaptic cleft. The neurotransmitters then diffuse across the space where they find open receptor sites on the postsynaptic neuron, which is the dendrite of the next neuron, called postsynaptic because it's after the synapse, after the synaptic cleft. So these sites recognize and respond to some neurotransmitters, but not to others. So if you look at the receptor sites, you know, there might be different colors. They might be different shapes. So you see the one that kind of looks like a purple bubble to the right. It doesn't fit into the lock. The best analogy I've heard for these is they're like puzzle pieces. So when you put together a jigsaw puzzle, sometimes, you know, like you just don't have the piece that fits. You might try to jam it in, but it's just not going to work, right? And so the postsynaptic membrane is only going to recognize certain neurotransmitters. So again, this is over here. We'll hopefully not get lines on the screen again, but between the axon terminal buttons of the presynaptic neuron to the dendrites, which then are connected to the cell body, the soma of the postsynaptic neuron. So again, action potential goes down the axon. It tells the vesicles, hey, time to, you know, open your Ziplocs and let whatever's in out. Those neurotransmitters go across the synaptic cleft. They go to the postsynaptic neuron. They're these puzzle piece sections that they can fit into. So again, we've mentioned neurotransmitters a couple times now. Neurotransmitters are chemical messengers that relay neural messages across the synapse to the next neuron. I kind of like this depiction of it because it looks like it's magic, but it's really just our bodies being really amazing, right? So these little chemical messengers are sent between neurons, and they essentially start the action potential of the next neuron. So we're going to start talking about all of the neurotransmitters, well, not all, but some of the major ones that really have implications for psychological functioning, psychological disorders. So the first one we'll talk about is serotonin. Well, here are actually the 7 of them that we will end up talking about. So the first one we'll talk about is dopamine. So dopamine, and all of these will be important for both normal function and will have some implications if the function of them is abnormal or off in some way. So dopamine produces sensations of pleasure and reward. So when you're normally functioning, anytime you do something that you find enjoyable, you've got dopamine being released in your synapses. So this might be talking to a friend. It might be consuming a substance you really like, whether that's some sort of food or whether that's some sort of drug, right? There's actually a lot of studies now showing that things like getting likes on our social media posts also activate dopamine. So some of the same brain functions can occur, and there's some evidence to suggest it might be similarly addicting to substances because of that. It's used also by the central nervous system in voluntary movement. So we do need it in order to tell our muscles, hey, do these things again. Whatever gesture I'm doing right now, I don't even know, right? However, when there are problems with schizophrenia, with dopamine, it can cause a lot of different psychological issues, including schizophrenia, as well as Parkinson's disease. So real quick thumbnail sketch of each. Schizophrenia is where you sense things that aren't there. Often it's hearing voices or seeing something that's not there. And also you believe things that just aren't true. You might have delusions that maybe you're Napoleon or God is speaking directly to you. And this is not to undermine anyone's religious experience, but to give you an example of a client I saw, she said God told her to cheat on her husband, which like is not in any part of the Bible I'm familiar with, right? So probably not. And then Parkinson's disease, I mentioned already, this is the neurological disorder Michael J. Fox has. It has what's called a resting tremor. So if you're not actively engaged in something, if I was just like resting my hand up here, I'd have the tremor. But if I went to pick up, say, my pointer, I'd be able to do that before the tremor started again. I actually know someone who plays the guitar who has Parkinson's, and he's able to still play the guitar because when he's actively engaged in playing, his tremors go away. So really interesting implication of dopamine here. Many substances affect dopamine, including cocaine, which is a stimulant drug, amphetamines. The most common of these is methamphetamine, so meth. So obviously we've all seen crazy ads where people look like zombies, right? Meth can be really scary. Can really mess with your life, unfortunately, because of how addicting it is. Amphetamines also were used in the past by some sports as performance-enhancing drugs. They're now banned in most professional sports. And Ritalin is actually a stimulant drug that helps individuals with ADHD focus. So that always sounds weird to people who aren't familiar with ADHD. They're like, why would you give someone who's hyperactive a stimulant? Because it works very specifically on a part of your brain called the prefrontal cortex. It's right here behind your forehead. It's like the most developed part of our brain. It's what makes us human. And people with ADHD have problems with that part of the brain. Essentially, it doesn't work all the time correctly, and that's one of the parts of the brain that helps us organize and focus and inhibit behaviors we shouldn't do. So what Ritalin does is it goes in and stimulates only that part of the brain. So again, very helpful for the people who have it. And then alcohol can also affect dopamine as well, but alcohol is a depressant. So it's gonna, instead of saying, go, 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 release a lot of dopamine, it's gonna do the opposite. Although you can feel good with alcohol. As we know, you can also end up feeling very sleepy, right? So antipsychotic and neuroleptic medications, so medications that are used to treat schizophrenia, to treat psychosis, and neuroleptic medications, medications that help with things like seizures, reduce dopamine activity in the brain. So this is good for getting rid of the side effect or the symptoms of the disorder, but they can have really serious side effects. So for example, what can happen if you take heavy doses of certain antipsychotics over long periods of time is you can develop something called tardive dyskinesia. It's essentially just a series of side effects where you end up doing a lot of involuntary movements. You might end up like the most common one is they lick their lips a lot. And then they also get what's called anhedonia, where they just don't feel like doing anything, kind of like depression. These medications can also cause weight gain, fatigue, and other problems. So one of the psychotic clients I saw, she had paranoid schizophrenia, and she gained close to 100 pounds after she started taking her antipsychotics. Now that's not typical, but obviously not outside of the realm of possibility. So again, you kind of have to weigh the pros and cons, like how do you want to be able to function in your life? And some of the more modern medications that we use for psychosis, things like schizophrenia, don't have these severe side effects to the same extent. And really interestingly, probably because they both work on dopamine, there's been a lot of study done on using neuroleptics, so things that might be used instead for Parkinson's or seizures, to also treat people with schizophrenia. All right, we'll cover one more neurotransmitter and then we will pause for the day. So we'll talk about serotonin. Serotonin is very closely related to dopamine. It also is related to feeling good, but it more than that, regulates things like sleep and dreaming. It helps with our mood. It's related to pain, aggression, appetite, and also to sexual behavior. So if our serotonin is out of balance, there's where we see things like depression, we see certain anxiety disorders, obsessive compulsive disorder, which used to actually be categorized as an anxiety disorder. But back in 2013, they redid how we do the diagnoses, and they actually gave obsessive compulsive disorder its own category, which is really interesting because it has some features of anxiety, but there are things that are so distinct from anxiety about OCD that they felt it warranted its own category. So this includes things like the trichotillomania we talked about when we were talking about the case of Chris in our research methods lecture. There's a disorder called excoriation disorder where you do skin picking compulsively, you can't stop yourself. And also hoarding is now a DSM diagnosis in this obsessive compulsive disorder category. So all of those would also be linked to imbalances in serotonin. And so maybe not surprisingly, it's not uncommon for someone who has one of these disorders to also have another one. In psychology, we call this comorbidity. Essentially, it means the disorders co-occur. And so it's not unusual to have both depression and an anxiety disorder, for example, or to have OCD, but also depression. Now, in terms of substances that affect our levels of serotonin, there's a class of drugs that are antidepressants and also work as anti-anxiety medications that are called SSRIs. And again, I will type this out for you in the chat. So they are called selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, SSRIs. And why they're called that is that what they do is, one step we didn't talk about when we were talking about the synapse is once the vesicles release their neurotransmitters and they go over and they lock into those receptor sites on the postsynaptic neuron, there's often still neurotransmitters floating around. So the vesicles have a system that's kind of like a vacuum. So ironically, we had the vacuuming today. I didn't plan that, I swear. And it sucks those back in so as not to waste them, essentially. What happens in people who have one of these disorders, depression, anxiety, etc., is that maybe they're not making enough serotonin, or maybe they don't have as many receptor sites as they should on the postsynaptic neuron. So the SSRIs actually go in and sort of stop up the vacuum, as if you sucked up a bunch of pet hair, for example. And so that way, the serotonin stays in the synapse longer, in that synaptic cleft, and has more opportunity to connect to those receptors. And that helps the person to feel better because now they're getting more experience of the serotonin. The other substances that can affect serotonin levels are hallucinogenics, like LSD. These are potentially very problematic because what happens when you take LSD is it actually just tells your brain to dump all of its serotonin all at once, which feels really great in the moment, but actually has ramifications for weeks to come afterwards because now your body has to work overtime to re-bring up the serotonin. So you actually can feel pretty awful after you take LSD. Alrighty, well, I'm going to end there for today. Thanks for sticking with me through vacuuming and technical issues today. I very much appreciate your patience, and hopefully this was helpful. And have a good weekend, and we'll keep talking about biopsych stuff on Monday.
Hi, I have a question.
Sure.
Okay, so I've been doing my Connect on both my